I was standing in the middle of a crowded terminal, clutching a one-way ticket, and wondering if my life could possibly get any lower, when a single whisper from a flight attendant changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. Have you ever had a moment where your entire reality shattered in less than 10 seconds, leaving you to pick up the pieces of a life that wasn't even yours? That day, I was supposed to be flying home to bury my father, a man I thought was a hero, but instead, I found out he was a ghost with a past so dark it made my skin crawl. I need you to listen to this closely and tell me honestly. If you found out your entire existence was built on a massive, calculated lie, would you walk away, or would you burn the whole thing down to find the truth? My name is David, and until 6 months ago, I was just an ordinary guy working a corporate job in Chicago, trying to make my way in the world while staying close to my roots. My father, Thomas, was a legendary figure in our small town, a retired pilot who was beloved by everyone for his kindness and his stories of the open sky. My mother had passed away when I was young, so it was just the two of us, and he was my rock, my mentor, and my best friend. When I got the call that he had passed away suddenly from a heart attack, it felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I packed my bags in a daze, barely able to breathe, and headed to the airport for the longest flight of my life. I was a mess, eyes red from crying, dressed in a wrinkled suit, just trying to hold it together long enough to get through security. As I boarded the plane, I was greeted by the usual bustle of passengers and the polite smiles of the cabin crew. But there was one flight attendant, a woman named Elena who looked to be in her late 60s, who stopped dead in her tracks the moment she saw my face. She didn't just give me the standard, welcome aboard greeting. She turned pale, her hand going to her throat as if she'd seen a literal ghost. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming I just looked as exhausted and haggard as I felt, but as the flight progressed, I noticed her watching me. Every time she passed my aisle, she lingered a little longer, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that felt almost intrusive. Finally, about 3 hours into the flight, when most of the cabin was dimmed and people were sleeping, she leaned down pretending to check my seatbelt and whispered, "You have his eyes, but you have her chin. I thought they told us the boy didn't make it out of the fire." My heart stopped. I asked her what she was talking about, my voice trembling, and she just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, and told me she'd find me after we landed. The rest of the flight was a blur of anxiety and confusion. Who was he? Who was she? And what fire was she talking about? My father had told me my mother died of an illness in a hospital, peaceful and quiet. When we finally touched down, I waited by the gate, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Elena found me near the baggage claim, her uniform jacket pulled tight around her as if she were cold. She took me to a quiet corner of the terminal and began to tell me a story that made my blood run cold. She told me she had been a flight attendant 40 years ago on a private charter line, and she knew my father. Only his name wasn't Thomas, and he wasn't a pilot. He was a man named Julian who had been a high-level fixer for some very dangerous people. She told me about a night in 1985, a night when a house went up in flames, a night when a young woman and her infant son were supposed to have perished. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "He didn't save you from a tragedy, David. He was the one who caused it, and then he stole you to start a new life because he couldn't live with the guilt of what he'd done to your mother." I felt like I was suffocating. This woman was claiming my hero father was a murderer and a kidnapper. It sounded like a movie script, something impossible, but she handed me a faded, yellowed photograph she'd kept in her wallet for decades. It was a picture of a beautiful woman holding a baby, and the woman had the exact same birthmark on her wrist that I have on mine. The man standing behind her, blurred but unmistakable, was my father, looking younger and harder, with a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. Elena told me that she had been the one to help them disappear initially, but she never knew he had taken the child until she saw me walk onto that plane. To make matters even more complicated, she explained that my father didn't just walk away from his old life. He had stolen a fortune from the people he worked for to fund our disappearance. This meant that for my entire childhood, we weren't just living a quiet life. We were hiding from people who would have killed us both if they'd ever found us. Everything I remembered, the way he always insisted on living in houses with multiple exits, the way he never let me take photos of him for school projects, The way he'd skin every restaurant before we sat down suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't protective parenting or old-school habits. It was survival. My mind raced through 25 years of memories, searching for cracks in the facade. I remembered a time when I was 10 years old, and a car had lingered too long at the end of our driveway. My father had stayed up all night sitting by the window with a shotgun across his lap, telling me he was just watching the stars. I remembered the 3 times we moved across the country with less than 24 hours' notice, him telling me it was for a better job opportunity, even though we ended up in smaller and smaller towns. Each memory felt like a blow to the chest. I was standing in that airport terminal feeling like my skin didn't fit my body anymore. Was I David? Or was I some ghost named after a tragedy? Elena gripped my hand, her voice a low, urgent rasp, telling me that I needed to be careful because even though 40 years had passed, some debts never truly expire. She told me that Julian, the man I called Dad, had spent his life waiting for the other shoe to drop. She handed me a small, rusted key she said he had given her decades ago, just in case he ever disappeared, telling her to give it to his son if he ever resurfaced. She explained that there was a safe deposit box in a small bank in Switzerland, a place my father had mentioned during a panicked flight years ago. He had apparently set up a contingency plan for me, one that included enough evidence to bury the people he worked for if they ever came after us. But that also meant I was now the keeper of secrets that could get me killed. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as I realized that the pilot stories he told me about navigating through storms were actually metaphors for how he navigated a life of crime and evasion. He wasn't flying planes, he was flying under the radar. Every birthday, every holiday, every warm memory of him teaching me to fish, or helping me with my homework was now tainted by the image of him holding a match to a house. I thought about the woman in the photo, my real mother. Elena said her name was Maria, and she was the only person who had ever made Julian want to be a better man, but his world wouldn't let him. The irony was sickening. He killed the woman he loved, and then spent the rest of his life trying to save the piece of her he had left. As I sat in the airport lounge staring at the key, I felt a deep hollow ache. I was grieving a man who didn't exist, and I was being haunted by a man I didn't want to know. Elena warned me that once I opened that box, there would be no going back. I would be stepping into a war that had been dormant for 40 years. She told me to go home, bury him, and decide if I wanted to be a victim of his past or the author of my own future. So there I was, standing in an airport with a dead father I no longer recognized and a history that felt like a house of cards. I had a choice to make. I could go to the funeral, bury the man I loved, and keep my mouth shut, or I could dig into the shadows and risk destroying his memory and my own identity. Before I tell you what I found when I went back to that house and opened the safe my father told me never to touch, I want you to pause. Think about the person you trust most in this world. Now imagine finding out they are the reason you lost everything you were supposed to have. What would you do? Would you seek justice, even if the person was already dead? Or would you let the secrets stay buried for the sake of your own peace? Drop a comment right now and tell me your move, because what I did next changed my life forever. I didn't go to the funeral home first. I went straight to my father's old study. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with the scent of his pipe tobacco and the silence of 1,000 lies. I remembered he had an old floor safe hidden under the rug in his library, something he told me held important documents for my inheritance, that I should only open after he was gone. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely spin the dial, but when the heavy door finally clicked open, I didn't find stocks or bonds. I found a leather-bound journal, and a stack of passports with different names, but my father's face. As I read through the entries, the horror of Elena's story was confirmed in his own handwriting. He had been hired to remove a family that knew too much about a local political scandal. He had set the fire, but at the last second he saw me through the window. He said he saw my eyes and couldn't do it. He pulled me out, but he was too late for my mother. Instead of calling for help, he panicked. He realized if he turned himself in, he'd go to prison and I'd go into the system. So he used his connections to forge death certificates, changed both our names, and moved 3 states away to become the kind, retired pilot everyone loved. He had raised me on the ashes of my own family. But the journal went deeper. It detailed the money he'd stolen, Millions of dollars laundered through various shell companies he'd set up over the years. He'd lived his life in a state of constant, agonizing guilt, writing page after page of apologies to a woman he'd killed, while simultaneously trying to be the perfect father to the boy he'd orphaned. It was sick. It was twisted. And the worst part was, I could see the love in the writing. He genuinely loved me, but that love was rooted in a crime so monstrous it defied logic. I found a map tucked into the back of the journal with a location marked in the woods behind our old house in Virginia, the place we lived before the first sudden move. He had written, "If they ever come for us, the truth is under the oak tree with the split trunk." I knew I couldn't just sit there. I drove 12 hours straight to that old property, my mind screaming at me to stop, to just go back and pretend I never met Elena. But I couldn't. I found the tree, and after digging for 3 hours in the middle of the night, I found a metal box. Inside were the real documents. My mother's jewelry, her marriage certificate to a man who wasn't my father, and a letter addressed to me. It explained that my real father had been a journalist who was murdered a week before the fire. My dad hadn't just killed my mother. He had finished the job of erasing my entire bloodline. The box also contained a digital drive. When I finally got back to a laptop and plugged it in, I saw folders upon folders of evidence, recordings, scanned documents, and names of people who were still in power today. My father hadn't just been a fixer. He had been a witness to the highest levels of corruption. He had kept this as life insurance, but it was also a death warrant. I spent hours watching videos of him talking to the camera, his voice breaking as he explained that he knew I would eventually find this. He said he hoped I'd never have to, but if I was watching, it meant he was dead and I was in danger. He told me he'd set up a trust fund in a neutral country that would activate only after his death was verified and his final testimony was delivered to the authorities. I realized then that my entire life had been a carefully constructed play, and the curtain was finally falling. The grief I felt for his death turned into a white-hot rage. I spent the next several days digging through old newspaper archives and tracking down the family I was supposed to have. I found out I had an aunt who was still alive, a woman named Sarah who had spent 40 years wondering why her sister and nephew had died in a freak electrical fire. When I showed up at her door, showing her the birthmark and the photos, she collapsed in my arms. She told me she had never stopped looking, never stopped believing that something was wrong about that night. Seeing her face, which looked so much like mine, made the reality of the theft finally sink in. He hadn't just taken my past, he had taken her family. I sat in her kitchen as she showed me photos of my real father, a man named Elias who looked exactly like I do now. He was a man of integrity, a man who died trying to expose the truth, while the man who raised me was the one who pulled the trigger on his happiness. The contrast was unbearable. I felt like I was betraying Elias by having ever loved Julian, and I felt like I was betraying the only dad I knew by seeking the truth. Sarah told me that for 40 years, the police had dismissed her claims, telling her she was just a grieving woman who couldn't accept an accident. My arrival was her vindication, but it was also a reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. The confrontation I wanted with my father was impossible because he was already in a casket, but the confrontation with his legacy was just beginning. I decided to cancel the public funeral. I had him cremated quietly, with no ceremony and no eulogy. I couldn't stand the thought of the town gathered to praise a man who was essentially a kidnapper. I took the evidence to the authorities, not because I wanted to tarnish a dead man's name for fun, but because my mother deserved the truth to be on the record. The fallout was massive. The small town was rocked by the scandal, and for a while people looked at me like I was the villain for ruining the memory of a good man. Local news crews camped outside my door, and I had to hire security because some of my father's old associates started sniffing around, wondering where that stolen money had gone. I ended up working with the FBI to trace the funds, turning over every cent of the inheritance to be returned to the estates of the people he'd stolen from. I didn't want a penny of his blood money. The process was grueling. I had to testify in closed hearings about the contents of the drive, watching as powerful men were led away in handcuffs because of a dead man's guilt. I was called a hero by some and a traitor by others. My father's old friends from the pilot community stopped calling. My neighbors looked away when I walked down the street. I felt like a pariah in the only home I had ever known. I ended up selling the house and everything in it, using the remaining legitimate assets to set up a foundation in my mother's name for victims of domestic violence and house fires. It didn't bring her back, and it didn't fix the hole in my heart, but for the first time in my life, I knew who I actually was. I spent months in therapy trying to reconcile the man who taught me how to ride a bike with the man who burned down my first home. It's a strange thing to mourn someone you realize you never actually knew. I kept wondering if any of his love for me was real, or if it was all just a desperate attempt to balance a ledger that could never be settled. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the face of a murderer's redemption project, and it made me want to scream. But then I would talk to Elena, the flight attendant who started it all. She told me that she had watched Julian for years before that final flight, and she saw the way he looked at me. She said his guilt was real, but his love was even more real. She believed he lived every day in a prison of his own making, and that his only hope was that I would grow up to be the man he never could be. That flight attendant, Elena, stayed in touch with me. She told me she felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders after 40 years of carrying that secret. She was the catalyst for my entire rebirth. It's strange how a random encounter at 30,000 feet can dismantle 4 decades of deception. I learned that day that the people we love are often complicated, and sometimes, the heroes in our lives are just villains who got a second chance they didn't deserve. I lost a father, but I found my soul. Looking back, I don't regret a single thing. Truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only thing that can actually set you free. If I had stayed silent, I would have been living a lie just like he did. And I refused to let his cycle of secrets continue through me. Always trust your gut, and never be afraid to look behind the curtain, even if you're scared of what's waiting there. My Aunt Sarah and I are rebuilding our relationship now, and for the first time, I have a family that doesn't feel like a secret. I finally have photos of my mother on my mantle, and I no longer have to look over my shoulder. The shadow of Julian is finally gone, and David, the real David, is finally home. I moved to a new city, changed my legal name to Elias Jr., and started a life that belongs to me, not to a story someone else wrote. I realized that the legacy we leave behind isn't about where we came from, but about the choices we make when the world gets dark. My father chose fire and theft. I chose truth and justice. The price was my entire childhood and the memory of a man I loved, but the reward was my integrity. Like this video if you think I did the right thing by exposing the truth, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people's lives changing in an instant. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Was my father a monster for what he did? Or was his attempt to give me a good life a form of redemption? Would you have kept the money and the secret? Or would you have done what I did? I'll see you all in the next story.